We get all kinds trying to sneak into first class these days." The words were delivered with a fake smile and a pointed glance at Evelyn Johnson, a renowned black oncologist in a custom-tailored suit. She had heard condescension before, but never like this. What began as an irritating microaggression at 30,000 feet was about to explode into a full-blown scandal, one that would leave a flight grounded, a crew in crisis, and an airline scrambling to salvage its reputation. What Evelyn did next wasn't just bold, it was historic. The polished chrome and hushed tones of the Ascend Air first-class lounge at Chicago O'Hare International Airport usually offered Evelyn Johnson a moment of tranquil transition before her frequent travels. Today was no different, or so she initially thought. Evelyn, a sharply dressed black woman in her late 30s, exuded an aura of quiet confidence that matched her bespoke emerald green pantsuit. Her understated gold jewelry and chic loafers spoke of success earned, not loudly proclaimed. She was a leading oncologist, en route to a critical medical conference in San Francisco where she was a keynote speaker. Her research was groundbreaking, her schedule relentless, and these few hours of anticipated comfort in Seat 3A were a small, cherished luxury. She sipped her sparkling water, idly scrolling through her presentation notes on her tablet. The boarding call for Ascend Air Flight 472 to San Francisco echoed softly. Gathering her carry-on, a sleek leather briefcase, and her purse, Evelyn joined the priority boarding line. The efficient scan of her boarding pass, the polite nod from the gate agent, the walk down the jet bridge, all proceeded with the familiar rhythm she appreciated. Stepping onto the aircraft, she was greeted by a flight attendant, a woman with meticulously styled blonde hair, a name tag reading Susan, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard," Susan chirped, her gaze flicking over Evelyn perhaps a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a subtle inventory being taken. "Thank you," Evelyn replied warmly, proceeding towards her seat in the second row of the plush first-class cabin. The cabin was sparsely populated at this early stage of boarding, a businessman already engrossed in his laptop in 1B, an older white couple settling into 2D and 2F. Evelyn stowed her briefcase in the overhead bin and settled into the wide, comfortable seat. She pulled out her noise-canceling headphones and a novel, anticipating the pre-departure beverage service, a small ritual she enjoyed. Susan was making her way down the aisle, offering drinks. She served the businessman, then the couple, with practiced ease and saccharine sweetness. When she reached Evelyn, her smile tightened, the warmth noticeably dimming. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Susan asked, her voice crisp, devoid of the earlier lilt. Evelyn, slightly surprised as she had just been scanned at the gate and her seat was clearly marked, nonetheless reached into her purse. "Of course." She presented the pass displayed on her phone. Susan peered at it, her scrutiny intense. "Evelyn Johnson, Seat 3A, okay." She handed it back, her tone implying that something was still not quite right, a lingering doubt. "Just making sure everyone is in their correct assigned seat. We get a lot of people trying to sneak into first class, you know." Evelyn raised an elegant eyebrow. The comment was gratuitous, the implication hanging unpleasantly in the air. "I'm sure you do, but I assure you, I'm where I'm supposed to be." Her voice was calm, betraying none of the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. She was accustomed to microaggressions, but the directness of this insinuation so early into the interaction set her on edge. Susan hummed, a skeptical sound. Then, as if remembering her duties, she asked, "And would you care for a pre-departure beverage? Orange juice? Water?" Her tone was noticeably flatter, more perfunctory than it had been with the other passengers. "Sparkling water with a slice of lime, please," Evelyn said, maintaining her composure despite the slight. Susan nodded curtly and moved on. Evelyn watched her for a moment, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of subtle, deniable prejudice, but it never failed to sting, to make her feel like an outsider in spaces she had every right to occupy. She tried to dismiss it, focusing on her book, determined not to let this woman's attitude mar her journey. Other first-class passengers trickled in, greeted with varying degrees of Susan's manufactured warmth. None of them, Evelyn noted with a growing sense of unease, were asked to show their boarding passes once they were past the initial greeting at the aircraft door. The man who took seat 3C, a white gentleman in a golf shirt, simply nodded at Susan and proceeded to his seat without a word exchanged, let alone a request for his credentials. The disparity was glaring. Susan returned with Evelyn's sparkling water, placing it on the small console without a word or a glance. Evelyn murmured a thank you to Susan's retreating back. The lime was missing. A small omission, perhaps, but in context it felt like another deliberate slight. Susan's brand of prejudice wasn't overtly aggressive, not yet. It was woven into the fabric of her service. A clipped tone here, a dismissive gesture there, an overzealous scrutiny reserved only for Evelyn. When she came by to offer newspapers or magazines, she'd present them with a flourish to the older couple across the aisle, detailing the sections of the Chronicle or the latest features in Global Traveler. For Evelyn, it was a cursory newspaper, held out almost as an afterthought, Susan already turning away before Evelyn could fully respond. The boarding process continued. A young black man dressed in trendy streetwear and expensive sneakers entered first class. He was assigned seat 4C. Evelyn watched, curious to see how Susan would react. Susan, who was near the galley, intercepted him almost immediately. Her voice was a little louder now, carrying through the quiet cabin. "Sir, can I help you find your seat? This is the first-class cabin." The implication was clear. "Are you sure you belong here?" "Yeah, 4C, he said, holding up his phone with his boarding pass displayed. "Boarding pass, please," Susan demanded, hand outstretched, her tone firm. The young man sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound of weary resignation, unlocked his phone again and showed her. Susan scrutinized it for an uncomfortably long time before nodding stiffly. "All right. Just ensure your luggage is stowed correctly." She didn't offer him a pre-departure drink immediately, instead busying herself with arranging items in the galley. Only after he settled and looked pointedly towards her did she approach him, her smile strained. "Drink?" Evelyn felt a surge of empathy for the young man. She made eye contact with him briefly and offered a small, understanding smile, which he returned with a slight nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of a shared, unwelcome experience, a common language spoken by those too often made to feel out of place. The main cabin door was about to close. The captain made his welcome announcement, detailing the flight path to San Francisco and the anticipated smooth journey. Evelyn allowed herself to relax a little, hoping that Susan's microaggressions would cease once they were airborne and the formalities of boarding were over. She was profoundly wrong. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Susan began the first-class meal service. She approached Evelyn's row last, after diligently taking orders from everyone else, including the young man in row 4, though her interaction with him remained perceptibly cooler, more abrupt than with the other passengers. "Ma'am," Susan said, addressing Evelyn, her voice carrying a hint of impatience that felt entirely manufactured for Evelyn's benefit. "We'll be starting the meal service shortly. However, before that, I just need to re-verify your ticket. There seems to be a slight discrepancy noted by the gate agent." This was new, and patently absurd. Evelyn's heart sank. The harassment was escalating. "A discrepancy? What kind of discrepancy?" Evelyn asked, keeping her voice even, though a cold anger was beginning to brew within her. She knew, with a chilling certainty, this was a fabrication, a pretext for further harassment. "I'm not privy to the details," Susan said, waving a dismissive hand as if swatting away an inconvenient fly. "I just need to see your boarding pass again and perhaps some identification. A driver's license or passport will do." Evelyn stared at her, the request hanging in the air like a challenge. This was no longer subtle. This was targeted, deliberate harassment. "I showed you my boarding pass when I boarded. It was scanned at the gate. There are no discrepancies. Airline policy, ma'am, Susan said, her voice hardening, her eyes like chips of ice. We need to ensure everyone, especially in our premium cabins, is correctly ticketed, for security reasons. She emphasized premium cabins with a slight sneer, as if Evelyn couldn't possibly legitimately belong. The businessman in 1B was now openly watching, his laptop forgotten, his expression one of mild curiosity turning to concern. The older couple across the aisle were whispering to each other, casting nervous glances towards Evelyn and Susan. The young man in 4C had his headphones off, his expression one of weary resignation. He had seen this script play out before. It's interesting, Evelyn said, her voice dangerously soft, each word carefully enunciated, that this particular airline policy seems to apply so selectively. You haven't asked anyone else for their identification post-boarding, have you, Susan? Susan's face flushed slightly, a faint pink tinge rising on her neck. I'm following procedure for a flag that came up on my manifest. If you just cooperate, Johnson, we can resolve this quickly. The use of her title felt mocking in this context. There is no flag, Evelyn stated, her gaze unwavering, holding Susan's eyes. You are singling me out. What identification do you require from me that you haven't required from the passenger in 3C, or 1B or 2D? She gestured to the white passengers around her, none of whom had been subjected to this third degree. Susan puffed up, her professional veneer cracking to reveal an undercurrent of belligerence. Are you refusing to comply with a flight attendant's lawful instruction, ma'am? The threat was clear, hanging heavy in the recycled cabin air. I wouldn't want to have to involve the captain or ground security over a simple verification. Evelyn felt a cold anger rise within her, sharp and clarifying. She had faced racism before, in the hallowed halls of academia, in the sterile corridors of hospitals, in the everyday transactions of life. But the blatant, escalating nature of this in a space she had paid a premium to occupy, a space meant for comfort and exclusivity, felt particularly egregious. She thought of the prestigious award waiting for her in San Francisco, the speech she was to give about innovation and breaking barriers. And here she was, a barrier of bigotry and ignorance personified by a flight attendant named Susan. Before I show you any documentation again, Evelyn said slowly, deliberately, I would like you to state clearly for the record why you are specifically requesting it from me, Evelyn Johnson, holder of seat 3A, and not from any other passenger in this cabin who has already passed all security and boarding checks. Susan's eyes narrowed into slits. I don't have to explain airline procedure to you line by line. Show me your ID, or this will become a security issue, a serious one. It already is an issue, Susan, Evelyn said, her voice like ice, sharp and cutting. It's an issue of harassment and discrimination. She reached into her briefcase not for her ID, but for her phone. She discreetly started an audio recording, a habit she'd reluctantly adopted for such situations. You are creating a hostile environment, and I assure you Ascendair will hear about it, loudly and clearly. Susan scoffed a harsh, ugly sound. Threats won't help you, ma'am. She leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially, yet loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, a performance for an unseen audience. Look, maybe you got lucky with an upgrade that didn't register properly, or perhaps this ticket isn't actually yours. It happens. People try all sorts of things. Just show me the ID that matches the name on the ticket, and we can forget this whole unpleasantness. Otherwise, the implication hung heavy in the air. Accusation of theft, of fraud, of deceit. Evelyn's mind raced. She could comply, show her ID again, and endure the rest of the flight under Susan's venomous watch, stewing in silent humiliation. Or she could escalate this in a way Susan clearly didn't anticipate, a way that would make it impossible to ignore. The humiliation was a burning coal in her chest, but so was a steely resolve forged from years of navigating such insidious encounters. This time it felt different. This time, she wasn't just going to endure. This time, she was going to make a stand. The silence in the first-class cabin was thick with tension, heavy as a storm cloud. Every eye was on Evelyn and Susan, a tableau of prejudice and defiance playing out at 30,000 feet. The businessman in 1B, Arthur Brennan, now had his phone out, angled discreetly but unmistakably filming the interaction. The older woman in 2D, Mrs. Henderson, looked distressed, her hand on her husband's arm, while Mr. Henderson seemed torn between indignation on Evelyn's behalf and a deep-seated desire not to get involved in a public confrontation. The young man in 4C, Jamal Williams, was watching Evelyn intently, an almost imperceptible nod of solidarity passing between them, a silent acknowledgement that her fight was in some ways his too. Evelyn took a slow, deliberate breath, centering herself. "Susan," she began, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that could cut glass. "I am Evelyn Johnson. I am a respected oncologist, a leader in my field. I am a keynote speaker at the National Medical Innovators Conference in San Francisco, an event of considerable prestige. This ticket was purchased for me by the conference organizers, and my name, Evelyn Johnson, is on it, along with my Ascend Air Zenith Tier frequent flyer number, which I've held for over a decade, accumulating more miles than you probably walk in a year on these aisles." Each word was delivered with precision, a careful dismantling of Susan's prejudiced assumptions. Susan's composure wavered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she quickly masked it with renewed, almost theatrical belligerence. "Titles and frequent flyer tiers don't exempt you from security procedures," Susan retorted, though her voice was a little less confident, a little more shrill. "And I don't appreciate your tone, ma'am. It's simple, ID now, or I will have the captain radio ahead, and you will be met by authorities upon arrival. That is, if you even make it to arrival." The threat of being removed from the flight, of being treated like a common criminal, was now explicit, ugly, and dangled with relish. "And I don't appreciate being racially profiled and relentlessly harassed," Evelyn countered, her voice rising slightly, firm but not hysterical, controlled anger radiating from her. "You have singled me out, and the young gentleman in 4C repeatedly, under the false guise of procedure. I will show my ID to the captain, or to a designated airline official who can explain to me, with a copy of Ascend Air's official written policy, why I, specifically, am being subjected to this discriminatory treatment. Not to you. Your behavior has been unprofessional, offensive, and frankly, deeply discriminatory." "How dare you accuse me of that?" Susan gasped, clutching her chest as if mortally wounded, her face a mask of performative outrage. "I am simply doing my job. Some people are just so quick to play the race card when they're caught doing something wrong or trying to get away with something." The race card comment hung in the air, ugly and undeniable, a final confirmation of Susan's bigotry. The businessman in 1B audibly scoffed. Mr. Henderson shook his head, muttering, "That's entirely uncalled for, young lady." Mrs. Henderson looked even more distressed. Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. This was it, the point of no return. "Playing the race card?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, each syllable dripping with contempt. "Or are you simply showing your true colors, Susan? You know what? You're right about one thing. I won't be showing you my ID. Not now, not ever." She then did something Susan clearly, in her wildest imaginings, didn't expect. She reached for her phone, not to display her boarding pass, but to make a call. The cabin lights for Wi-Fi and cellular service were on, as the plane was still at an altitude where connection was possible for calls, though often spotty and usually discouraged for casual conversation. This was anything but casual. "What are you doing?" Susan demanded, a note of genuine panic finally creeping into her voice, her carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble. "You can't just make calls like that. That's against regulations during certain phases of flight." A desperate, inaccurate bluff, as they were well past those restricted phases. Evelyn ignored her, her finger hovering over a contact in her phone. It was a number she rarely used, reserved for dire circumstances, a lifeline to someone who could move mountains if necessary. The contact name was simply Marcus R. Marcus Reynolds was not just a casual friend. He was a senior partner at the prestigious law firm that handled Ascendair's most significant corporate litigation and crisis management. More than that, he sat on several influential city boards in Chicago and had an almost mythical ability to get things done with quiet, decisive efficiency. She pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. Susan was now sputtering. "I'm going to get the captain." "You are disrupting this flight. You are a security risk. You will be arrested." She made a clumsy, agitated move towards the cockpit. "Let her go," Evelyn said calmly to the concerned faces around her, her gaze steady. She looked at the young man in 4C. "May I get your name, please? And are you comfortable being a witness to this entire exchange?" "Jamal Williams," he replied, his voice clear and steady, a surprising calm amidst the turmoil. "And yes, ma'am, I've seen the whole thing. She hassled me too from the moment I stepped on board." "Thank you, Jamal," Evelyn said, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. Just then, the call connected. "Evelyn, everything all right? You don't usually call this particular line." Marcus's voice was deep, calm, and instantly reassuring, a balm to Evelyn's frayed nerves. "Marcus, I apologize sincerely for calling you like this," Evelyn began, her voice a stark contrast to the agitated atmosphere Susan had created. "I'm on Ascendair Flight 472 from Chicago O'Hare to San Francisco, currently airborne. I am being relentlessly harassed and racially profiled by a flight attendant named Susan Miller. She has repeatedly demanded my ID without cause, implied I'm not a legitimate first-class passenger, and just now accused me of playing the race card when I called out her discriminatory behavior. She is now threatening to have me removed from the flight or arrested upon arrival." She could hear the faint click of Marcus typing furiously on his end. "Flight 472, you said. Attendant's name Susan Miller? Are you in any immediate danger, Evelyn?" His voice was all business now. "I don't believe I'm in physical danger," Evelyn replied, glancing towards the cockpit door which remained closed for the moment. "But the situation is escalating rapidly, and it's utterly unacceptable. She's also targeted another young black passenger, Jamal Williams, who is willing to corroborate. I have an audio recording of part of the exchange. Other passengers are witnessing this. This flight attendant is a significant liability to Ascendair, and frankly, Marcus, I don't feel safe or respected enough to continue this journey with her as part of the crew." Susan returned, a smug, triumphant look on her face, trailed by the first officer, a stern-faced man in his late 40s with an air of harried importance. The captain, it seemed, had delegated this escalating mess. "Ma'am," the first officer began, his eyes sweeping over Evelyn with a prejudging sternness. "Flight attendant Miller informs me you've been uncooperative and are causing a disturbance to the flight." He deliberately used Susan's last name, Miller, lending her a formality and credibility she hadn't earned in Evelyn's eyes. "Marcus, the first officer is here now," Evelyn said into the phone, her voice steady. "He's already taken flight attendant Miller's side without hearing my account or speaking to any other witnesses." On the other end, Marcus said, "Evelyn, put your phone on speaker if you feel comfortable. Let the first officer hear this conversation directly." Evelyn nodded, though he couldn't see her. "First officer," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I am currently on the phone with Marcus Reynolds. He's senior counsel for the law firm that represents Ascendair on major legal matters. I believe he'd like a word with you. Marcus, you're on speaker." The first officer's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Susan Miller's smugness faltered, replaced by a look of disbelief and dawning horror. The name Marcus Reynolds, associated with the airline's top legal counsel, was clearly not one they expected to hear invoked by a passenger. Marcus's voice filled the small space around Evelyn's seat, calm but radiating an unmistakable authority that commanded attention. "First officer, this is Marcus Reynolds. I am indeed senior counsel with the firm that represents Ascendair. Johnson is a highly respected client of our firm and, I should add, a personal friend. I am also a Zenith Tier frequent flyer with Ascend myself. I'm hearing some extremely disturbing allegations regarding the conduct of one of your flight attendants, a Miss Susan Miller, towards Johnson and another passenger. These allegations include targeted harassment, baseless accusations, and clear racial profiling. This is not just a customer service issue, First Officer. It's a serious legal and public relations liability for Ascend Air, should these allegations prove true, and I have every reason to believe Johnson. The first officer looked from Evelyn's phone to a now visibly paling Susan, then back again. His stern demeanor was cracking, replaced by a look of growing alarm. "Sir, I was just informed of a passenger refusing to show identification and being disruptive." "First Officer," Marcus interrupted smoothly, his tone like silk-wrapped iron. "Johnson has informed me she is more than willing to show her identification to an impartial airline official or the captain himself, but not to an attendant who has reportedly been harassing her for the better part of an hour. More importantly, she has informed me that Miss Miller accused her of playing the race card. Is that the kind of conduct Ascend Air condones or wishes to defend from its first-class cabin crew?" Susan Miller went white as a sheet. I never said that exact phrase," she stammered, looking wildly around as if seeking support or a denial from the air itself. But the faces around her were grim and accusatory. The businessman in 1B, Arthur Brennan, coolly stated, "Yes, you did. I heard it distinctly, and I have it on video." He held up his phone pointedly. The first officer looked like he'd swallowed a live wasp. He shot Susan a furious, withering glare. The situation was spiraling out of his control and into territory he was clearly unprepared for. Marcus continued, his voice relentless but still maddeningly calm. "Now here's what's going to happen. This flight is carrying a number of valuable passengers, not least Johnson, who is on her way to a significant professional engagement. The current environment in that first-class cabin sounds untenable and frankly toxic thanks to Miss Miller's alleged actions. I am advising Johnson, as her representative in this immediate matter, not to subject herself to further harassment or feel compelled to continue this journey under these hostile conditions. I am also, in my capacity as counsel familiar with Ascend Air's interests, strongly advising Ascend Air that allowing this situation to continue with Miss Miller on duty with Johnson is a monumental mistake with potentially severe repercussions." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I am, as we speak, in direct communication with Ascend Air's executive leadership team. They are being briefed on this situation in real time. Johnson mentioned she doesn't feel safe or respected continuing the flight with this attendant. Ascend Air takes passenger safety and credible accusations of discrimination by its employees very, very seriously. So, First Officer, you and your captain have a choice. Address this immediately and decisively, or I assure you the fallout for Ascend Air, and personally for those who fail to act appropriately and protect the company's interests and reputation, will be substantial." The first officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Evelyn with a newfound, if reluctant, respect, then at Susan, who was now trembling slightly, her earlier arrogance completely deflated. He seemed to be rapidly calculating the disastrous ramifications of Susan's behavior and his own initial handling of the situation. What are you suggesting, Mr. Reynolds?" the first officer asked, his voice strained, almost a whisper. "I'm not suggesting anything about the flight's operation directly to you, First Officer. That's the captain's purview upon receiving all critical information," Marcus stated carefully, maintaining a professional boundary. "I am telling you that Johnson is the victim here, and Ascend Air needs to treat her as such with immediate effect. And I'm making it abundantly clear to the highest levels of your airline that Miss Miller's continued presence serving Johnson is unacceptable and untenable." Evelyn watched, a sense of grim vindication washing over her, mixed with a dawning apprehension of the scale of what was unfolding. The power dynamic had shifted, dramatically and irrevocably, with one phone call. Before the first officer could formulate a response, the cabin intercom crackled to life. It was the captain's voice, sounding unusually tense and clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts if you are not already seated. We are experiencing some unexpected operational issues that require our immediate attention. We will be communicating with ground control and will update you shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for a possible course alteration. A wave of murmurs and uneasy whispers swept through the entire plane, audible even in the shocked silence of first class. Diversion. Return. What operational issues? Susan Miller looked utterly aghast, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. The first officer seemed stunned into immobility. Evelyn caught Jamal's eye. He gave a slow, amazed shake of his head, his expression a mixture of shock and awe. Into the phone, Evelyn whispered, "Marcus, what exactly did you do?" Marcus's voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "I simply informed the CEO, whom I happen to know is a stickler for brand reputation and utterly intolerant of discrimination suits, about a credible, unfolding incident of racial harassment on one of his flagship aircraft, involving a prominent individual and recorded evidence. I suggested that perhaps the current crew configuration was untenable for ensuring a safe, respectful, and legally sound environment for all passengers, particularly Johnson. I believe he's taking that advice very, very seriously." A few minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the captain came on the intercom again. His voice was tight, formal, and carried an unmistakable weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. Due to an unforeseen and urgent crew issue that cannot be resolved in flight, and to ensure the continued safety, security, and integrity of our service standards for all passengers, Ascend Air has made the difficult but necessary decision to cancel Flight 472. We will be returning to Chicago O'Hare International Airport immediately. We understand this is a significant disruption to your travel plans, and we sincerely apologize. Ground staff will meet the flight to assist with rebooking and accommodations. Further information will be provided upon our arrival at the gate. Cancelled. The entire flight. Cancelled." A collective groan, punctuated by exclamations of disbelief and frustration, rippled through the aircraft. Business trips, long-awaited vacations, important family appointments, all thrown into chaos by one flight attendant's bigotry and one passenger's refusal to tolerate it. Susan Miller looked like she had seen a ghost, or perhaps her entire career flashing before her eyes and crashing into a fiery wreck. Her face was ashen, her mouth agape. She sank heavily into the attendant's jump seat, staring blankly ahead, the fight completely drained out of her. The first officer avoided looking at anyone, his expression grim and unreadable as he quickly retreated to the cockpit, the door closing with a decisive click. Evelyn ended the call with Marcus promising to update him once they landed. She leaned back in her seat, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, replaced by a weary sense of gravity and the enormity of what had just occurred. One call. It hadn't been her intention to cancel an entire flight, to inconvenience hundreds of people. Her intention had been to stop the harassment, to be treated with basic human dignity, to assert her right to exist in that space without prejudice. But Susan Miller's relentless bigotry and Ascend Air's potential multi-million-dollar liability had cascaded into this unimaginable outcome. The businessman in 1B, Arthur Brennan, looked over at Evelyn, a mixture of awe and profound sympathy on his face. "Wow," he mouthed silently. "Just wow." The older couple, the Hendersons, seemed shocked but also somewhat relieved that the ugly confrontation was decisively over. Mrs. Henderson gave Evelyn a tentative, supportive smile. Jamal Williams simply looked at Evelyn and said, his voice quiet but clear, "Thank you." Not for the cancellation, surely, as his plans were also now in disarray, but for standing up, for not backing down, for showing him, and everyone else who witnessed it, that sometimes enough was truly enough. As the plane began its slow, ignominious descent back toward Chicago O'Hare, Evelyn knew this was far from over. The inconvenience to the other passengers weighed on her, a heavy burden of unintended consequences. But the principle at stake, the unwavering stand against blatant racism, felt more significant, more vital. Susan Miller had picked the wrong black woman to harass on the wrong day, and now, An entire flight was paying the immediate price for her prejudice. But Susan, Evelyn suspected with a grim certainty, was about to pay a much, much higher one. The wheels of karma, set in motion by arrogance and ignorance, were just beginning to turn, and their grinding sound was becoming deafening. The mood on Flight 472 during its sullen return to Chicago. O'Hare was a strange and uncomfortable cocktail of frustration, bewilderment, and simmering anger from the scores of inconvenienced passengers, overlaid with a palpable residual tension in the first-class cabin. For Evelyn Johnson, it was a surreal, almost out-of-body experience. She hadn't sought this level of disruption, this grand, sweeping intervention. Yet a part of her, the part that had been pricked and prodded by countless similar, if less dramatic indignities over the years, felt a grim sense of justification. The systemic tolerance of micro, and in this case not-so-micro aggressions, often meant that those who were targeted were expected to absorb the discomfort, to be the bigger person, to let it slide for the sake of peace or propriety. Today, the discomfort had been redistributed, albeit on a much larger, more public scale. Upon landing, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, his tone flat and weary, instructing passengers to remain seated until authorized ground personnel boarded the aircraft. The jet bridge connected with a familiar thud, but instead of the usual rush to disembark and reclaim disrupted schedules, an air of anxious anticipation and morbid curiosity filled the plane. Soon, two stern-faced individuals in crisp Ascend Air corporate attire and an airport security supervisor boarded. One of them, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp, intelligent eyes, who introduced herself as Miss Janine Holloway, head of in-flight services for the Chicago hub, walked directly to first class. The other corporate figure, a man, stayed near the cockpit, engaging in a low, urgent conversation with the pilots. Miss Holloway's eyes scanned the first-class cabin, briefly acknowledging the other passengers with a curt nod before settling on Evelyn. "Johnson?" she asked, her voice polite but unequivocally firm. "Yes," Evelyn confirmed, meeting her gaze steadily. "I am Janine Holloway. On behalf of Ascend Air, I want to offer our sincerest and most profound apologies for the irregularities and unacceptable treatment you experienced on this flight. We understand this has been an extremely distressing and offensive situation for you." Her gaze flicked momentarily, like a shard of ice, toward Susan Miller, who visibly cringed under the managerial scrutiny. "We'd like to speak with you privately at your earliest convenience to get your full account of these events. We have a private lounge area prepared for you, away from this." "Thank you, Miss Holloway," Evelyn said, appreciating the immediate offer of a more dignified setting. "I'd appreciate that. I also believe Mr. Jamal Williams in Seat 4C, who was also visibly targeted by Flight Attendant Miller, should be included. His account would be valuable as well." Miss Holloway nodded without hesitation. "Noted, Johnson, and absolutely, Mr. Williams," she said, addressing Jamal with a respectful tone. "We would appreciate your statement as well, if you're willing to provide it." Jamal, who looked exhausted but resolute, agreed immediately. "Happy to help. What she did wasn't right to either of us." Miss Holloway then turned her full attention to Susan Miller. Her voice lost any semblance of conciliation, becoming icily professional and devoid of warmth. "Miss Miller, please gather your personal belongings. You will be escorted off the aircraft by airport security to an administrative office. You are suspended from duty, effective immediately, pending a full and thorough investigation into multiple serious complaints regarding your conduct on this flight. You are not to interact with any passengers or crew further. Your access to airline systems will be revoked by the time you reach the terminal." Susan stared aghast, her face crumpling. "Suspended? But I was just doing my job, following procedure. She was being difficult. She was threatening me." Her voice was rising, cracking with desperation and disbelief. The airport security supervisor, a large, impassive man, stepped forward slightly, a silent but clear indication that resistance would be futile. Ma'am, please. Let's not cause any further disruption here. We can discuss this in private, away from the passengers. Susan looked wildly around, her eyes darting from face to face as if expecting anyone to leap to her defense to validate her actions. But the faces in first class were impassive or openly condemnatory. Arthur Brennan in 1B was still pointedly holding his phone, a silent testament to the evidence he held. Even her fellow flight attendants, emerging cautiously from the galley, kept a professional, almost fearful distance, their expressions carefully neutral. The career-ending implications of her actions were dawning on Susan with brutal, horrifying clarity. Defeated, her shoulders slumped, she fumbled for her purse, tears now streaming down her face as the security officer gently but firmly guided her towards the exit, past the gawking, whispering passengers in the rows behind. A walk of shame that would surely haunt her. Once Susan was off the plane, Miss Holloway addressed the remaining first-class passengers, her voice regaining a measure of professional calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we deeply apologize once again for the unprecedented cancellation of this flight and the circumstances leading to it. Ascend Air is committed to the safety, respect, and dignity of all our passengers. This incident is being taken with the utmost seriousness at the highest levels of this company. Ground staff are prepared to assist every one of you with rebooking, hotel accommodations if needed, and meal vouchers for your inconvenience. We will also be taking statements from anyone who witnessed the events in this cabin, should you wish to provide one. Your cooperation would be invaluable. The businessman in 1B, Arthur Brennan, immediately raised his hand. My name is Arthur Brennan. I saw and heard most of it, and I have clear video footage. Her behavior was appalling, frankly racist, and completely unprofessional. The older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, also volunteered. We'd be happy to tell you what we saw and heard. That flight attendant was completely out of line with Johnson, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice trembling slightly with residual indignation. No one should be treated like that. Miss Holloway thanked them profusely, taking down their names and seat numbers, assuring them someone from her team or the legal department would speak with them shortly. Then, she personally escorted Evelyn and Jamal off the plane, creating a subtle buffer to shield them from the curious stares and grumbled complaints of the deplaning economy passengers, many of whom were understandably upset and vocal about the sudden cancellation. In a quiet, comfortable VIP lounge tucked away from the chaos of the main terminal, Evelyn and Jamal gave their detailed, unhurried accounts to Miss Holloway and another Ascend Air executive, a Mr. David Chen from their corporate legal department, who had arrived with surprising speed, indicating the severity with which the airline was treating the matter. Evelyn recounted every microaggression, every pointed question, every dismissive gesture, every demand for ID, Susan's condescending tone, the infamous and inflammatory race card comment, and the subsequent threats. She was calm, factual, and unwavering in her recollection, her credibility shining through. Jamal corroborated her story meticulously, describing his own experiences with Susan Miller's pointed scrutiny and dismissive attitude from the moment he boarded. He emphasized how Evelyn's firm stand had, in a way, validated his own feelings of being unfairly targeted, and had given him the courage to speak up as well. Arthur Brennan, the businessman, was also brought into the lounge. He played his video footage for Miss Holloway and Mr. Chen. The recording clearly captured Susan Miller's aggressive questioning of Evelyn, her dismissive hand gestures, her raised voice, and crucially, her race card remark, delivered with sneering contempt. The audio was crystal clear, damning, and irrefutable. Mr. Chen's expression grew increasingly grim as he watched, his legal mind no doubt calculating the enormous potential damages, both financial and reputational. This footage is unequivocal and deeply disturbing, Mr. Chen stated, looking at Miss Holloway with a somber expression. The behavior exhibited by Miss Miller is in direct and egregious violation of Ascend Air's code of conduct, our explicit anti-discrimination policies, and frankly, basic human decency and professional standards. Miss Holloway nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Johnson, Mr. Williams, once again on behalf of the entire Ascend Air organization, we are profoundly sorry. There is absolutely no excuse for what you endured. Ascend Air will be taking the strongest possible disciplinary action regarding Miss Miller. Her employment is under immediate and serious review, and based on this incontrovertible evidence, termination is not just highly probable, it is the only acceptable outcome. What about her history? Evelyn asked, her voice steady. I find it incredibly hard to believe this was her first time behaving this way. This level of malice felt practiced. Miss Holloway sighed, a weary sound. That is a critical part of our internal investigation, Johnson. We will be reviewing her entire service record, including any past passenger complaints or internal red flags, however minor they might have seemed at the time, or however they might have been previously dismissed. If there's a pattern of such behavior, and I suspect we may find one, it will become evident and will only strengthen the case for her permanent removal. Ascend Air, clearly understanding the PR nightmare and significant legal jeopardy they faced if they mishandled this, moved with uncharacteristic speed and decisiveness. Evelyn was immediately rebooked on the next available flight to San Francisco, in first class on a partner airline, with a personal assurance from Miss Holloway that her journey would be seamless and she would be met by a representative on arrival. Jamal, whose travel plans were more flexible, was offered a generous flight credit voucher for future travel, a full refund for his ticket, and an automatic upgrade to first class on his next 3 bookings with the airline. Both were also offered significant monetary compensation for the distress, humiliation, and disruption they had suffered, an offer Evelyn said she would consider after speaking further with Marcus Reynolds. Before Evelyn left for her rescheduled flight later that afternoon, Miss Holloway assured her of a direct update within 48 hours regarding the initial findings and actions concerning Susan Miller. We understand the need for swift, transparent, and decisive action, Johnson. You have our word on that. Evelyn finally arrived in San Francisco late that evening, physically and emotionally exhausted, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She delivered her keynote speech the next day, her voice resonating with an added layer of conviction and passion as she spoke about overcoming obstacles, the imperative of innovation not just in medicine, but in societal attitudes, and the quiet power of resilience. True to her word, Miss Holloway called Evelyn 2 days later. Her tone was grave but resolute. Johnson, Janine Holloway began, I wanted to update you personally as promised. The investigation into Susan Miller's conduct on Flight 472 has concluded. Based on your detailed testimony, Mr. Williams's corroborating statement, the irrefutable video evidence provided by Mr. Brennan, supporting accounts from other first-class passengers like the Hendersons, and critically, a statement from one of her junior crew members who, emboldened by these events, came forward to report witnessing prior concerning and discriminatory behavior from Miss Miller towards other minority passengers, which she had previously been too intimidated to report. Miss Miller's employment with Ascend Air has been terminated, effective immediately. A wave of profound relief washed over Evelyn. It wasn't about revenge, but about accountability. It was about ensuring that Susan Miller would not have the opportunity to inflict such humiliation on another passenger. Thank you for letting me know, Janine. That is the right decision. Furthermore, Miss Holloway continued, her voice tight with what sounded like genuine dismay. We have reviewed Miss Miller's complete personnel file. There were several past passenger disagreements noted, some with veiled accusations of rudeness or attitude problems, particularly in interactions with minority passengers. Unfortunately, none were as well documented or escalated with such compelling evidence as your incident. Your courage in speaking out so clearly, Johnson, and Mr. Reynolds's decisive intervention brought this situation to a head in a way that previous, perhaps more timid or less well-supported, complaints regrettably did not. We are now undertaking a comprehensive reassessment of how such complaints are handled, logged, and escalated. We are also immediately implementing mandatory enhanced anti-bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation training for all frontline staff, starting here in our Chicago hub and rolling out company-wide within the next quarter. This, Evelyn felt, was the more significant victory. A single firing might remove one problem employee, but systemic change, even if prompted by a crisis, could prevent future Susans from harming others. It could change the culture. That's very good to hear, Janine. That kind of training and policy review is incredibly important, Evelyn said, a measure of hope in her voice. Ascend Air is also preparing a formal public apology, which will not name you directly unless you explicitly wish for us to do so, but it will address the incident on Flight 472 and reaffirm our unequivocal commitment to non-discrimination and the respectful treatment of all our passengers. And the compensation offer we discussed still stands, of course, with our deepest and most sincere apologies once more for everything you were forced to endure. Evelyn accepted the apology and the compensation, a significant portion of which she immediately decided to donate to a non-profit organization that fought racial injustice and supported diversity initiatives. She had lost a day of her life to this ordeal, endured considerable stress, and inadvertently caused widespread inconvenience to many. But something crucial had shifted. A line had been drawn, not just for her, but for the airline. The karma for Susan Miller, however, was not yet complete. Her firing was just the beginning of a much larger, more public reckoning. The termination of Susan Miller's employment with Ascend Air was swift and decisive internally, but the ripples of her actions on Flight 472 were destined to spread much further and last far longer in the unforgiving court of public opinion. In the hyper-connected age of social media, stories of outrageous behavior, especially those involving clear allegations of racism and dramatic, almost cinematic consequences, have a way of taking on a ferocious life of their own. Marcus Reynolds kept Evelyn informed of some of the less public, more systemic repercussions. Ascend Air, stung badly by the negative publicity and genuinely alarmed by the potential legal exposure. Marcus had made it clear that Evelyn had grounds for a substantial lawsuit, which she chose not to pursue vigorously in exchange for concrete systemic changes, not only implemented the enhanced anti-bias training Miss Holloway had promised, but also launched a company-wide top-to-bottom review of its complaint handling procedures. They established a new, more robust and visibly independent channel for passengers to report incidents of discrimination or serious misconduct, with clear, transparent protocols for investigation and swift disciplinary action. They even invited Evelyn, anonymously through Marcus's discreet channels, to provide confidential input into the content and structure of the new training curriculum, which she agreed to do, focusing on the insidious nature of microaggressions, the importance of cultural sensitivity and humility, and effective non-discriminatory de-escalation techniques. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, also took quiet note of the incident, though no federal aviation regulations were found to have been broken by Evelyn's call or the airline's ultimate decision to cancel the flight for operational reasons related to crew suitability. However, the Flight 472 incident became an internal case study within aviation circles and HR departments about crew resource management, the critical importance of de-escalation techniques, and the significant operational, financial, and reputational costs of mishandling passenger interactions, especially those involving serious accusations of discrimination. The fact that one passenger's justified complaint, amplified by a well-connected and determined contact, could lead to an entire flight cancellation was a sobering and expensive lesson for the entire industry. It underscored the changing power dynamics and the increasing intolerance for prejudice. The other passengers on the canceled Flight 472 had their own stories to tell, their own inconveniences to nurse. Most were simply frustrated by the significant delay but eventually moved on with their lives, their travel plans rerouted. Some, however, like Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, later told Evelyn via a letter forwarded by the airline that the incident had made them more aware and more vocal advocates for respectful and equitable treatment in all service industries. Arthur Brennan's blog post had a widely read follow-up piece where he discussed the incident as a necessary wake-up call for a more conscious and less tolerant societal attitude towards casual prejudice, particularly in service industries where power dynamics are often skewed. Jamal Williams, the young man who had also been unfairly targeted by Susan, found an unexpected and welcome silver lining. After his name was, with his explicit permission, mentioned in a few sympathetic articles that highlighted he was also a victim of Susan's profiling, he was contacted by a diversity and inclusion officer from a major tech company he had long admired. They'd been impressed by his composure and dignity during the incident, as described by Brennan and corroborated by others, and his articulate willingness to stand as a witness. This initial contact led to an informational interview and eventually to a promising job opportunity in their Chicago office. It was an unforeseen but welcome twist of fate, a small counter-narrative of positive karma emerging from the otherwise ugly mess. As for Susan Miller, her attempts to fight her termination through the flight attendants' union were ultimately unsuccessful. The evidence against her, particularly the crystal-clear video and audio footage, multiple corroborating testimonies from respected passengers, and the damning statement from her own junior colleague about a pattern of behavior, was overwhelming and indefensible. The union, while obligated to provide her with initial representation, likely recognized the untenable nature of her case and the significant damage it could do to their broader membership's reputation and their relationship with the airline if they were seen to be vigorously defending blatant, documented racism. Evelyn never rejoiced in this news. Instead, she saw it as a tragic but inevitable consequence of choices Susan had made repeatedly, choices rooted in a prejudice that society still grappled with daily. The dramatic cancellation of Flight 472 was a disruptive, shocking event, but it had served a larger purpose. It had forced a major airline to confront an uncomfortable truth within its ranks and take tangible, visible steps towards ensuring such an incident wouldn't happen again. It had empowered other passengers, perhaps, to find their voices. And it had shown, in no uncertain terms, that sometimes when the system fails to protect you, one determined voice, and perhaps one very influential phone call, could change everything, bringing a very specific, very personal, and very public form of karma home to roost with undeniable force. The memory of Susan Miller's face, contorted first in smug, unwarranted authority, and then in dawning, uncomprehending horror, would stay with Evelyn for a long time, not as a trophy of a battle won, but as a somber reminder of the responsibility that came with any position of power, however small, and the devastating, far-reaching impact of its abuse. The real victory wasn't in Susan's personal downfall, but in the hope that future Evelyns and Jamals, in skies around the world, would face a little less prejudice, one flight, one interaction, at a time. And so the saga of Ascendair Flight 472 serves as a stark reminder. Discrimination carries a hefty price, and sometimes justice isn't just served, it's delivered with thunderous flight-canceling impact. Evelyn Johnson's stand wasn't just about a seat in first class. It was about dignity, respect, and the courage to confront prejudice head-on, leading to unforeseen but powerful consequences for a flight attendant who let bigotry cloud her judgment, and an airline that was forced to confront its own shortcomings. What did you think of Evelyn's bold move? Was the flight cancellation a justified response to the harassment she faced? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar, where a seemingly small act of prejudice escalated? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Let's discuss this important issue and learn from each other. If this story resonated with you, or if you believe in standing up against injustice in all its forms, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, true-to-life stories where karma always, eventually, catches its flight. Your support helps us bring these narratives to light and keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching.